It's time for Innocence Lost by Crime in Court with Heather, revealing the human side of judicial errors and the lives that are affected by it. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Crime in Court with Heather. It's been a while. I didn't mean to be gone for so long. I did kind of take a little bit of a break to regroup and kind of rethink how I was doing things on my channel. I was basically in transcript limbo where I was basically, I started the Menendez brothers transcript from 1996, which is a 6-month trial, and I'm reading it all word for word. It's taking forever, so that was kind of wiping me out. Plus, then I started the Delphi transcript because that came out at the same time. So doing two trial transcripts at the same time was kind of wiping me out. Plus, I had to, on another side of things, I had to regroup and rebrand things on my life coaching business. I had to create a brand new website because I lost my domain. I had to basically, because I had to change my website, I had to rebrand all of my content. And then somehow along the way, I found out, I mean, it just became like one it just like rolling onto another. I can't think of the word I'm looking for. How like an avalanche. It just like kept coming and coming. Like one thing happened and then I would learn something else and then I had to do something more. So for my life coaching business, it took me a heck of a long time to regroup, rebrand all of that stuff and get things organized. So now that I have that done, I am here and I'm ready to come back to Crime in Court and give you guys. So I'm starting off slower. I'm going to be doing on the weekends, just so you guys have an idea. On Sundays, we're going to do trial transcripts exposed. So you're either going to get Menendez Brothers or the Delphi trial, one or the other. We're going to alternate weekends. And then on Thursdays, you're going to get the corruption files, which any kind of deep dive on anything. We could go to do deep dives on Turtle Boy. We could do a deep dive on Charlie Kirk. We could do a deep dive on all sorts of things. So just be aware of that. And we're going to branch off and do some different things that we haven't talked about before in this channel. And then third, I have brought back, as you can see, Innocence Lost. This was my wrongfully convicted series that I really enjoyed. I just have a passion for wrongfully convicted individuals. I have a passion for people being treated fairly with the law and everything. And I'm finding that it's not necessarily the case. So for bringing back Innocence Lost, we're going to be talking about Robert Roberson, who we've talked about before on my channel. He has been set for execution twice now, and both times it's been stayed. So we're going to get into that. So the first time was in 2024, and his execution was stayed. And then just recently in 2025, he was on death row again, even though he had a pending appeal. I don't know how that happens. And then his execution was stayed one more time. So we're going to actually go into his story a little bit deeper. So I'm going to shrink myself here, and I have put together a lovely presentation of slides for you guys. So this is Robert Roberson, and we're going to talk about junk science and how people get convicted and nearly executed for science that isn't even accurate. So let's get started. The background of the Roberson case. So, Robert Roberson, he is an autistic father. That is a very important factor because his autism, his affect, comes into play later with investigators and medical staff. So he's an autistic father. You can see him pictured here with his daughter, Nikki. He was convicted in 2003 for Nikki's death. He was accused of murdering Nikki by do you guys remember shaken baby syndrome where like there was this thing apparently back in the early 2000s, late 90s where people thought you could just shake a baby to death. Well, yeah, maybe, but anyways, it's not a real thing, shaken baby syndrome, and it has been debunked since. So that is going to come into play a lot in this in as we go along. So anyways, he was accused of shaking Nikki to death. But according to experts and the evidence, there was no abuse. Nikki died from illness. There's going to be many experts that say this, that have reviewed her autopsy at this point. Nikki died from being very ill and multiple factors on top of being ill. So it's a very complex situation that was completely overlooked. So, Robert Roberson has been sitting in jail on death row in Texas for over 20 years, and like 23 years, I think, by now, 24. And he's been fighting for his innocence ever since. His autism, like I said, is really important because he didn't even know he had autism at the time. It was diagnosed post trial. Post trial. So, after trial took place, he was then diagnosed with autism. So how can the jury have any kind of clear picture of anything if they don't even know that the accused has autism? Because it definitely skewed the way that people perceived him in this case. All right, so Nikki Curtis's death. Nikki was 2 years old when she died. She was a very ill child, and we'll get into that a lot more. So she died in 2002 from severe pneumonia, which was complicated by other factors. She had a fever, multiple infections, and she also had a minor fall from bed the morning of her death, which investigators are like, oh, well, that must be abuse. Not really. She was also given prom- promethazine, I hope I say that right, promethazine and codeine. So promethazine was like a cough suppressant, and codeine in her cough syrup, both dangerous for children. So she was prescribed like double doses of the promethazine by different doctors because she had been to the emergency room multiple times, or at least like an immediate care multiple times before her death, like leading up to her death. She was at the emergency room like twice or something like that, I think. Roberson's autism was misread by the hospital staff as guilt at the time of her death, even though they gave her all these medications that suppressed her breathing. So there were some investigation missteps. This is Detective Wharton, and in the beginning, when he was investigating this, he completely backed the state's case, saying this was shaken baby syndrome and all the things. But now he knows that Robert Roberson is innocent. He has claimed it multiple times. He is advocating for Robert now. This is the detective that tried to put him away. This is the detective that investigated him in the beginning and found him to be guilty of it. Shaken baby syndrome. He has since changed his mind and says now Robert is innocent and he is fighting for his release. He even admits, I believe, that this case was rushed because infant, infant child, and all this medical stuff was just ignored, but you just see a hurt or injured child and they automatically thought the parents, which was not the case in this case. And there is new evidence now of a natural death, which was ignored by the courts. And even in some of his appeals, because Robert has appealed multiple times since his conviction, and he's kind of run out of his appeals. But now this new stuff about shaken baby syndrome and a change in the law is allowing him to file this habeas corpus for relief, basically um, because of this junk science. So new evidence has come in and basically proven that Robert is innocent. The trial itself was flawed. So the conviction was based off of this now debunked shaken baby syndrome hypothesis, which the state had, I can't remember, it was like hundreds of times that the state said the word shaken or beaten or something along the lines of being physical with his daughter, which, you hear that so many times as the jury that is lending to a bias, perhaps. Also, there was a nurse on the stand who brought up some unproven sexual abuse claims, which swayed the jury, but they're unsubstantiated. There's no proof of them. So where did this nurse come up with it? Who knows? The state and people love to get involved into who knows? Who knows where she came up with this? She could have maybe thought that he was, because of his affect, because of his autism, that he was guilty. So she immediately, like in her mind, assign that kind of guilt to him. I don't know. But for whatever reason, some nurse testified to him sexually abusing his daughter, which is not the case, and there's never been any proof for that. Prosecutors also used this outdated science and they ignored all of the medical evidence that Nikki had been ill and all the doctor's visits beforehand and the medications that she was on and the things that the forensic pathologists find later. And then, of course, autism led to the misjudgment of his behavior because he wasn't acting right, like there's a right way to be when your daughter dies, but whatever. All right, so new evidence that supports his innocence has now come out. So with this most recent habeas, it's been a while, but back in February of 2025, he filed a new habeas corpus. Um, Before I get into that. So he files a new habeas corpus, and now we have all this new medical evidence. We have multiple medical experts that have reviewed her case and her autopsy and have found that Roberson could not have done this. So here we have supporting medical evidence. Nikki died very specifically from pneumonia. Multiple professionals are going to tell us this. Pneumonia, which also led to sepsis and no signs of abuse. Okay. She had high promethazine levels, which is a respiratory suppressant. So she couldn't breathe because of all the stuff that she was prescribed by doctors prior to this day. The CT scans that they took at the hospital showed only a minor fall. So what happened was Robert claims that he woke up and he was in a panic because he had Nikki in the bed with him in the parents' queen size bed, which was up on like some cinder blocks, and he had, the box spring and the mattress. So this is a high bed, and for a 2-year-old to fall, that could be painful. So, well, anyways, the 2-year-old, Nikki, fell out of bed and he found her unconscious on the floor. So he knows that she fell out of the bed and that's what he, tells investigators, but they see it as abuse somehow. But the CT scans at the hospital proved there was no abuse. The experts confirmed that no abuse occurred. And we're going to get into a Dr. Laposata, not to be confused with the Dr. Laposata from the Karen Reed case who testified, and she was like amazing, amazing forensic pathologist. This is a different forensic pathologist, Michael Laposata. No relation, I don't believe. I looked, I tried to find one, but I don't believe they're related. So this Michael Laposata submitted an affidavit with the most recent habeas corpus filing. So we're going to get into some of the things that these medical experts have said, and we're also going to get into the appeal. So Sit tight. All right, so Dr. Laposata in his affidavit says natural causes, not a homicide. Here is Dr. Michael Laposata's February 2025 report, or excerpts from it, I should say. I took some, these are much longer documents. I just took some of the parts that I want to uh, bring into this presentation so that we get some clarification. So Dr. Laposata says, Nikki Curtis was born on October 20th, 1999. Nikki's medical records reflect that she was an infant and toddler who suffered from chronic infections, including sinus, ear, and respiratory infections, beginning with an ear infection when she was 8 days old. Okay. So when I said she was a sick child, I meant she was a sick child. Ever since she was 8 days old, she was in and out of hospitals and suffering chronic infections. Her doctors treated her infections with a variety of antibiotics prescribed over a dozen times during her short 27-month life. So he's reviewed all of the medical records for her 27 months of life. Yet her infections recurred or persisted. So whatever the doctors did, nothing helped. Because her persistent ear infections did not respond to the prescribed antibiotics, Nikki was referred to an ear, nose, and throat specialist who eventually surgically implanted tubes in both ears. Yet, even after her surgery, Nikki's ear infections continued. On January 28th, 2002, Nikki was taken to Palestine Regional with a 1 week history of diarrhea and vomiting. So she was sick that whole week up until her death. And this is actually the first, I think this is the first time she goes um, to see a medical doctor. So a doctor diagnosed Nikki with a viral infection and prescribed her with promethazine in suppository form and lo- loperamide, and gave instructions to follow up with the pediatrician in 2 days or to return to the ER. So she did go to the ER if problems persisted. So that was the ER, perhaps, Palestine Regional. I don't know if it's the ER or what, but anyways, they told them to go to the ER if problems didn't go away. So that same night that she went to the doctor, Nikki was still very sick and had a fever and was reporting a fever of 103.1. Her father took her to her pediatrician's office the next morning, January 29th, 2002, where her temperature was measured at 104.5. That is a very high fever. The pediatrician diagnosed Nikki with a fever, possible viral etiology, or unresolved upper respiratory tract infection, and gave her a prescription of Omnicef and a second prescription of Phenergan cough syrup with codeine. So basically, she got a double dose of this promethazine stuff and on top of it with codeine. Nikki's postmortem toxicology results showed that she has significantly elevated levels of promethazine, or yeah, whatever, the generic name for Phenergan. I don't know if I'm saying any of those are correct, in her blood. So she had significantly elevated levels of this medication that the doctors prescribed to her on the 28th and the 29th. That had nothing to do with Robert Roberson. Opinions and conclusions from Dr. Michael Laposata. Before I reviewed any of the expert reports or post conviction testimony transcripts, I reviewed Nikki Curtis's complete medical records, the complete autopsy file, and a chronology of her medical visits before her death. Those records show a striking medical history for Nikki of chronic infections throughout her life and several acute, life threatening events around the time that Nikki turned 1 year old, in the form of apneic episode. She had apnea, sleep apnea, when Nikki stopped breathing, turned blue, and had to be revived. So at the age of 1, she was having problems with breathing. She was having apnea. and other acute and chronic infections. Nikki clearly had a severe infection during the last week of her life before her collapse on January 31st, 2002. Nikki also had elevated liver enzymes indicating abnormalities in her liver functioning. Those results show that Nikki's liver was unable to make new proteins. The proteins required to form a clot. This is very important because this comes in to Dr. Michael Laposata's final conclusions that Nikki, because of all of the stress and all of the things that were going on, the trauma that her body was going through, she developed this other thing called DIC. I don't even know, I can't tell you what it stands for, but it's this other thing where um, she can't clot her blood. So she's excessively bleeding or excessively bruising. So the proteins required to form a clot, known as the coagulation factors, are not synthesized in normal amounts in a liver where the synthesis of proteins is less than normal, a condition with multiple low coagulation factor levels, as found in this case. So she has low coagulation factor levels, can be contributory to bleeding throughout the body or a bleeding disorder, which we'll get into. Based on my experience, the soft tissue swelling and associated small subdural hemorrhage shown on Nikki's Palestine Regional CT scan on January 31st, 2002 is consistent with her father's report that he found her on the floor after an apparent fall. So this expert saying the the damage, the injuries that I saw to Nikki are not conclusively, but can definitely be considered from falling off of a bed. The accidental fall with possible head impact, again, the bed was on cinder blocks, so she could have hit her head on a cinder block on her way down, which is very unfortunate. The accidental fall with possible head impact could also have contributed to Nikki developing moderate DIC. DIC is this bleeding disorder. However, given Nikki's chronic illnesses and her acute respiratory infection during the last week of her life, infection appears to be the primary cause of Nikki's DIC. So, any number of things that happened during that week could have actually caused DIC, but just the infections alone in her body were enough to cause this DIC condition. So this is important because prosecutors, the judge who was overseeing the appeal, who denied Robertson his, any kind of relief, basically state that, all the bruising and the damage, the bleeding, it's all because he was physically injuring her. But no, if we learn now, if we look at the medical records, she has this condition now that's called DIC, which is a bleeding disorder. Your blood cannot clot. It is often deadly. And so this infection, all these infections alone could have caused this, is what this expert is saying. The initial and subsequent CT scans show that Nikki's brain had swollen from lack of oxygen and then created intracranial pressure, causing her brain to shift from the midline to the left. There was no damage to the brain tissue itself and no brain contusions. That's very important. Therefore, her brain and other vital organs shut down due to the lack of oxygen. And what do we know about promethazine or promethazine, however you say that? It slows your breathing. And she had a double dose of it with codeine, both terrible for children. She was resuscitated after the point where her brain had already been severely deprived of oxygen, as indicated by fixed and dilated pupils upon arrival at the Palestine ER. So he's giving you facts, man. He's like, this is the reason why she was already unconscious and she would not have been able to have survived, even if they had brought her back at the hospital. The blood that was observed outside of the brain during the autopsy was not present during the CT scan, which is further evidence that it is DIC because she didn't have this bleeding prior, but it happened after she got to the hospital. The most plausible explanation of Nikki Curtis's bleeding and bruising is the development of DIC starting months before the event that took her life. So she had this DIC long before because of all these infections and things that she was going through. That is super important. I mean, that alone makes you say, like, why haven't they let him out yet, right? At least I'm thinking that. So, Nikki's medical records and her post-mortem autopsy toxicology results show that Nikki had in her system significantly high amounts of promethazine. I don't know if I'm saying that right, as a likely result of the two separate prescriptions her doctors gave her caregivers on two consecutive days after her collapse. So she had, like I said, she got a double dose of that. Her medical records also show that one prescription Nikki received on her second visit was for phenirigan combined with codeine. Both phenirigan and codeine are respiratory suppressants, which mean they can inhibit breathing. Since Nikki's death, the FDA has warned physicians against prescribing promethazine to young children Nikki's age or anyone experiencing respiratory illness because of the association with respiratory failure and death. And death. So promethazine alone could have killed her. Additionally, codeine, a narcotic, is no longer prescribed to children under the age of 18. These drugs are expressly associated with the risk of respiratory failure and death. In Nikki's case, her medical history, her father's report of her accidental fall from the bed, her medical collapse, her clinical course in the hospital after her collapse, and her postmortem results are all consistent with Nikki's death due to her infection. The respiratory suppressing medications she received in the days before her collapse and her short fall, which caused her to become unresponsive. Her condition was so severe that she developed DIC, which in turn causes internal bleeding and susceptibility to bruising. He's saying all of these things could have contributed to her death, but none of it from Robert. My review of the expert reports of Dr. Ronald I don't know how you say that, Francis Green, Keenan Bora, and Julie Mack. These are some other experts that we're going to hear from. Confirm my conclusions. Dr. Green's report contains microscopic evidence that Nikki's lungs were infected by both viral and bacterial pneumonias that had progressed to the point of sepsis. Multiple experts are confirming this. Both his report and Dr. Bora's report support my conclusion that Nikki's infection progressed to sepsis, which has a mortality rate of between 30 and 50%. Dr. Bora's report indicates that Nikki had dangerous levels of promethazine far beyond therapeutic levels that likely contributed to her respiratory distress and alone could explain why she became unresponsive. Dr. Mack's report is consistent with Nikki's laboratory results indicating she had moderate DIC. Because Dr. Mack observed, so this is another doctor saying she had most likely developed this DIC. Because Dr. Mack observed only a small subdural hematoma in the head scans, not the more extensive intracranial bleeding found at autopsy 2 days later. And Dr. Mack's review of the progression of the abnormalities on Nikki's chest CT scans indicates that she had lung infection that was becoming more severe during her hospitalization. So she was just getting worse. Finally, I have also studied the photographs that were taken of Nikki after she was initially intubated, as well as the autopsy photographs taken 2 days later by the medical examiner. The light bruising on Nikki's chin and touch bruises on one cheek are entirely consistent with DIC and do not suggest inflicted injuries. How many people do you think have been put away for similar situations like this or had their kids taken from them by the government? A child with DIC whose body was being handled. Did I Missed something. The additional yeah, I missed a sentence. The additional bruising, including the site on the top of Nikki's head where the pressure monitor had been surgically inserted into her skull at Dallas Children's and then removed before transport for autopsy, do not suggest inflicted injuries. So there were a lot of bruises just from the hospital, uh, from what the hospital did to her, different treatment that would leave bruises behind. A child with DIC whose body was being handled during resuscitation efforts and treatment would be quite susceptible to bruising. So, just the handling of that body could cause bruising, which is just horrific to think of Nikki having to go through that. There is no sound basis for concluding that any of the relatively minor marks and bruises observed on Nikki's exterior were caused by inflicted trauma or abuse. So that was a really, I mean, he had an excellent affidavit. He went on and it did explained things even in more detail. But I think I gave you guys some of the good parts there because he explains it so well. So with his new expert testimony, all these experts that have come forward for his habeas, there's been 10 pathologists that have all reviewed and all agree now that there was no abuse and the original autopsy, the original medical examiner ignored all of the non-homicidal factors like her illnesses, her medications being prescribed, the high level of promethazine in her blood. All of those things were just completely ignored. The DIC. Dr. Green is one of those experts that agrees pneumonia caused sepsis and eventually led to her death. Dr. Bora said promethazine worsened her breathing issues, which you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. We all could probably figure that someone with respiratory breathing shouldn't be given a double dose of something that suppresses your breathing. And then Dr. Mack says that the scans that they took showed no signs of trauma, the CT scans. So all those joint pathologists, those 10 pathologists got together and they wrote a letter or a statement together. So we're going to read some portions of that. It says, at the time of the 2002 autopsy and then the 2003 trial, medical experts generally considered the combination of subdural hematoma, retinal hemorrhage, and encephalopathy, I don't know if I'm saying that, sufficient swelling of the brain, I believe is what that is, um, swelling or hemorrhage of the eyes, and subdural hematoma would be bruising under the skin. So that would be enough to make a determination of shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma back in the early 2000s. It's amazing how far we've come just from the turn of the century. Now, the profession's understanding of these issues has evolved. So, this is them basically explaining, this is 10 joint pathologists coming together to explain shaken baby syndrome is not a thing and Robert Roberson is innocent. They say a forensic pathologist performing an autopsy today would consider undiagnosed pneumonia, dangerous medications, and a short fall as significant and sufficient to explain Nikki's condition and subsequent death. In 2004, we understand that the medical examiner, Dr. Jill Urban, this is wild, was asked if she would meet with Mr. Roberson's counsel, the Innocence Project, and medical experts who have re examined Nikki's case and concluded that her death was not a homicide. So, Dr. Urban, the medical examiner, the person who determined that Nikki was abused, will not sit down with Mr. Roberson's counsel, the Innocence Project, and other medical experts. They basically were like, "Hey, we'd like to talk to you. Could you sit down with us? We'd like to talk to you about your findings." Reportedly, Dr. Urban, still employed by the same organization where she did this autopsy, was unwilling to participate in a meeting with Roberson's experts and offered only to give his defense counsel a 15-minute phone conference. So I'll only talk to you over the phone for 15 minutes. That's it. You got questions about the autopsy? I'll give you 15 minutes. What kind of wild thing is that? So, in our view, that is insufficient in a case of this complexity. Medical examiners should be objective and willing to engage with multiple stakeholders in criminal investigation. So, she's not even willing to come to the table to have a discussion. That's really crazy. We conclude, based on our understanding of the facts as recounted in Exhibit 1, that the 2002 autopsy performed on Nikki Curtis was not reliable. The conclusions regarding cause and manner of death were reached on February 2nd, 2002, the same day that the autopsy was performed. These conclusions have never been revisited by the medical examiner. Usually, they do go back and just double check some of their findings. Further, they could not withstand scrutiny in light of contemporary scientific understanding because it is now known that many naturally occurring phenomena, such as infection, genetic disorders, and accidental shortfalls with head impact, can produce the same intracranial conditions once thought to be diagnostic of inflicted head trauma. So, all those things that you say is abuse by Roberson actually has a medical explanation for it. Each of the shaken baby premises considered medical orthodoxy in 2002 to 2003 when Mr. Robertson was arrested and tried has since been entirely undermined by evidence based science. We now know that we were wrong, basically, is what they're saying. None of the shaken baby syndrome principles have ever been validated, and many have since been debunked by evidence based medicine and biomechanical engineering studies. Mic drop. Nothing has been validated on shaken baby syndrome, yet we have people in prison on death row for shaken baby syndrome. Why is that? Medical evidence that Nikki had an advanced infection, interstitial viral pneumonia, and a secondary necrotizing bacterial pneumonia. So she had two forms of pneumonia, and DIC cannot be dismissed or ignored in making a reliable cause of death determination. Recent assessments by an array of highly qualified medical experts have resulted in well documented opinions that there was no homicide, suggesting that Mr. Robertson should not have been prosecuted for murder, let alone convicted and sentenced to death. So there was no homicide. Let Robertson out. He shouldn't be there. The likely injustice on display in this case threatens the integrity of the entire practice of making cause and manner determinations about in study deaths, particularly of children, where the entire basis for presuming that a crime occurred rests on medical opinions. With our signatures below, we urge an independent, objective reassessment of the cause and manner of Nikki Curtis's death. Signed by 10 separate pathologists. Like, how often do you get 10 separate pathologists 10 separate people to come together and agree on anything, right? And all of them agree that Nikki's death needs to be reinvestigated, and they said there's no homicide. So, very, very, very strong statements from some very uh, experts. They're good. They have quite a resume, all of them. All right, so let's talk about new scientific developments. Shaken baby syndrome hypothesis has been discredited by modern science. We know that, and those 10 pathologists just told us so. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned similar cases, or a similar case at least. This case, darn, I didn't put the year down. It's a more recent case. I might have it in another slide. It's called Ex parte Rourke, and this is an individual who was convicted, and same thing, he got his conviction overturned, or at least he got like a new trial because he proved that the science had been debunked, and this, he was It was junk science that put him away, basically. So he's allowed a new trial. So this sets a precedent now, this ex parte Rourke, because this has happened. This lays the foundation that now Robert Robertson can get his case reviewed. Um, Nikki's illnesses also mimicked shaken baby syndrome. As we know, all of the things, the bruising, the bleeding, all of that could be considered abuse if you're not looking at her actual medical records. And the misdiagnoses led to the wrongful conviction. No one understood. No one was really looking for the why. Texas law now allows relief for new science. So there's a new law that came into play, but it's not retroactive. Um, but we'll get into that. It's not typically retroactive for older cases. I think it started in 2021 or something. We'll get into it's on another slide when this new law comes into place for junk science and how you can have your case um, looked at or get a new trial because of that. So the Texas Criminal Courts of Appeals originally denied prior habeases that Roberson had filed without ever reviewing the actual evidence or reviewing that this is junk science. So he's been going through the motions trying to get this done multiple times and he's been denied multiple times. The systemic failure, slow to accept evolving forensics and the disability bias. So the criminal justice system takes a really long time to catch up to the medical professionals and their opinions. And it takes a long time. The medical guys are up here and the I totally lost my train of thought. They're not on the same wavelength. Anyways, so forensics, oh my God, I just totally had a brain fart. I'm sorry. I hate that word, but whatever. The disability bias also. Oh, that's what I was saying. So the science, the forensics are up here, and the courts are still down here. Like what? What's shaken baby syndrome? They're still like learning about shaken baby syndrome. Where up here they're like, dude, that's so 2000s, and we've moved past that. So the court system doesn't catch up, and all the people that have been wrongfully convicted on junk science and shaken baby syndrome, where, how many people have been convicted on this, which it's crazy to think about because I'm sure there's many. So basically, eventually, Robert Robertson did get the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals to remand his case finally to the back to the lower court. So his case was remanded, where now the courts have to the prosecutor have to actually prove the science that Robertson is saying is not, it's junk. All right, so his execution and legal battles, this kind of will give us more of a timeline here. So he originally had an execution set for October 17th, 2024. 90 minutes prior to execution, it was stayed. And there were a bunch of games played with this poor guy. But 90 minutes before his execution, the courts stayed his execution and he was saved temporarily. So what happened was there was this bipartisan uh, swell, I guess, of lawmakers that wanted to subpoena, all sides wanted Robertson to come and testify about this junk science. So, in order for him to testify, they said that they needed him in person and all this stuff. And eventually, it ended up being blocked by the AG, the Attorney General Ken Paxton, who would not let Robertson come and testify in person about the junk science and all of that. But he eventually was able to do it over Zoom, and it did save him time. His execution was stayed, and so that did buy him some time. Um, without Whoops, I just knocked my water over. Sorry, that was loud. Without actually, I don't know, without actually like resolving anything. So Robertson has an appeal pending, and even despite that, the prosecutor's office, the DA's office, schedules him for another execution October 17th, 2005. So that was just this past year. And to help you with the timeline, the habeas filing was February 19th. So he had this habeas that was pending. And they're like, that's okay. We don't care that you're trying to appeal your death sentence. We're just going to execute you and then you could figure that out later, right? I mean, this is pretty final, guys. It's like a no-brainer. You don't execute someone when they have a pending appeal. I can't talk right now. So anyways, yeah. So he had an appeal and they were like, "Nah, we're going to execute you instead." As far as clemency efforts, the parole board has denied him clemency. That was back in 2014. I'm sorry, 2024. I was looking at the November 16th, 2024. That was before the first execution date. Governor Abbott can grant a reprieve if you'd like to contact him, but he hasn't acted yet. So I don't know what he's waiting for. And then there was once a petition. This was prior to the execution date when it was still upcoming. There were over 116,000 signatures on a petition to support Roberson's release and or at least getting a new trial. But clemency efforts now have been kind of on hold because the Texas Court of Appeals or Criminal Court of Appeals ruled in his favor and he is getting a new trial or a review, I should say, of his case. So finally, the legal victory, October 9th, 2025, I'm sorry, not California, the Texas, I'm looking at the C and thinking California, the Texas Criminal Court of Appeals, that's what the CCA stands for, stays his execution. And this time it was days before, not minutes before, and remands his case back to the lower courts due to this junk science, due to shaken baby syndrome being totally outdated now. So the new scientific evidence was unavailable at trial. The things that we know now with the new forensic pathologists and all of their findings, that's new. We didn't have that before. New evidence that we have now would likely have changed the outcome, I think. It's very and the courts agree with this. This is coming from the courts. This is coming from the Court of Appeals saying that this new evidence would likely change the outcome. And they did their own review, a de novo mean on their own. They did a review and they bypassed the trial court, and that's how they remanded it, or why they remanded it, I should say. So his ongoing legal battle. February 19th, 2025 was the habeas where he was seeking relief based on the Rourke precedent, and we know that that was remanded. So at this point, it's kind of like in limbo. We're waiting for the next step in that part to if it's an evidentiary hearing or some kind of hearing that needs to take place. I'm sure we'll find out more when that happens. In fact, I know that Roberson wanted things early. Here, that's my third point. In 2006, in 2026, the defense is pushing for early evidentiary hearing. So that's what we're kind of waiting on for this habeas. On October 9th, the Court of Criminal Appeals remanded the case for a full review. Full review. Whoops, I skipped. Sorry. And then as of now, he has no execution date because the case is in limbo at the district level. So the district court now has to decide, are we going to continue to go after him? Are we going to let him go? And of course, the state never wants to say, "Oh, we were wrong and sorry about that." here's the key, you can let yourself out. They never want to do that. So they're probably going to fight it tooth and nail, my opinion. But we'll see. So this is coming straight from the ruling from the Texas Criminal Court of Appeals. And these are some really strong points that they make in favor of Roberson's case. They say, we recognize that the changes in the scientific knowledge underlying shaken baby syndrome would have resulted in different expert opinions, and as relevant to the Rourke case, the one that sets the precedent, would have resulted in an acquittal. So they're saying if what we know now was litigated, was adjudicated, would we get the same result? No. He's saying no, he would be acquitted. He would not have been found guilty. That's coming from the higher court ruling. That's pretty amazing. Like, you don't usually get that strong of a sentiment from the upper courts. Dr. Urban herself testified that it would be impossible to differentiate between evidence of shaking and evidence of actual impacts. So the medical examiner herself said it's impossible to differentiate what's abuse and what's shaking, what's actual hitting. No, she says you can't tell. So what are we doing here? Judge Parker would have the court and the jury separate out evidence of shaking, contrary to what Dr. Urban testified as possible. This Judge Parker was ruling on other habeases in the past, I believe. But applicant's conviction rested on both shaking and multiple impacts, shaking and beating. As discussed later, this is precisely why applicant's claims should be remanded for evidentiary development. So the junk science claims should be remanded because the whole case by the state was about shaking or beating. Those two words were repeated many times throughout their presentation. All of the applicant's experts uniformly concluded that the evidence was insufficient to support applicant's conviction. So all of the experts that provided evidence in Roberson's case conclude it's insufficient to find him guilty of anything. And the scientific knowledge underlying the state's theory at trial had changed such that no expert would testify today that Roberson caused Nikki's death. So no one would testify to that now. Dr. Ophoven, I don't know if I'm saying that right, also, so these are statements where they're going to say people agreed with certain things. So Dr. Ophoven also stated that the vast majority of head injuries in children Nikki's age are in fact caused by falls, and that Dr. Urban's testimony lacked any scientific basis for the determination that the mechanism of Nikki's head injury had to have been deliberately inflicted and thus the result of homicide. So the medical examiner did not have any scientific basis for concluding a homicide. Discussing Dr. Urban's autopsy report, Dr. Green stated that he disagreed with the cause of death listed on the autopsy. Furthermore, Dr. Green opined that Nikki's death may have been hastened by use of a combination of drugs that suppresses respiration. These are like no-brainer type things, but why did it take 20 plus years to figure it out? I don't understand. I mean, when you don't have the experts or you don't have the money, yeah, it can be difficult. And because the Innocence Project took this case on, that might be why they were able to finally go back and get such strong evidence. As to the lung scans and Dr. Green's finding, Dr. Mack agreed with Dr. Green and concluded that the cause of the increasing opacification seen over the course of several x-rays, so the darkening of the bruising, the darkening of the blood when she's bleeding, the darkening of her bruising of her skin, That's what the opacification means. Seen over the course of several chest x rays is not simply edema related to resuscitation efforts. In other words, that the increasing opacification, the increasing darkening, was caused by disseminated intravascular coagulation, DIC. That's what it is called. Disseminated intravascular coagulation. She no longer can coagulate her blood or clot her blood appropriately, most likely related to sepsis and a complication of Nikki's long-standing lung disease. So she's had lung disease for her whole life since she was 8 days old. And the Texas Criminal Court of Appeals is saying they're saying these are strong findings. They're saying Dr. Green and Dr. Mack and all these people, all of them agree on this stuff. And they're putting they're putting a really good, strong argument as to why this should be remanded back to the lower courts and looked at the scientific evidence. So Dr. Bora concluded that the post-mortem toxicology results and the medication history are significant and may have contributed to her death. Judge Parker asserts that Nikki had extensive injuries to the face and the back of the head, which were described as massive and very extensive, including bruising on her chin and the left side of her jaw and cheek, the right side of the forehead, the back of her head, and just inside each ear. However, as highlighted by Dr. Bora, sepsis could cause bruising similar to what Judge Parker asserts as evidence of guilt. So all the things that these other courts said when they denied his habeases in the past were that it was an indication of abuse and Roberson's guilt. But here we are finding that all of these things could have been related to the sepsis and the DIC and all the infections and her being so sick. And she has a very complex medical history, and you can't just discount it. In summary, Dr. I don't know, Ayer concluded that Nikki, a sickly child from birth, with repeated episodes of breathing apnea when she would stop breathing and turn blue, and quite ill for a week before her death. She suffered from interstitial pneumonia, which led to cardiac arrest due to the profound effect of deficient blood oxygenation on the blood pressure. So now they're saying, too, that she had cardiac arrest and her heart couldn't pump anymore. I mean, this is so sad when you think about all the things that Nikki was going through that morning, and they just had the complete wrong idea. I mean, I don't think that they could have done anything to save her at this point. I think the morning that she went in, she was already unresponsive, and I don't think that she could have been saved. But it just goes to show you that it was a very complex medical history, and there's not just like one answer to this. So the same doctor then discussed why the misdiagnosis occurred. Dr. Ayer opined that in 2002, shaken impact syndrome was believed to be a unitary entity and was regularly diagnosed. So back in 2002, oh sure, we diagnosed shaken baby syndrome all over the place. However, by 2009, shaking went mostly out the window, and by 2017, shaking was debunked. Moreover, Dr. Ayer noted that many of the events have nothing to do with Roberson, and he could not conceivably be held responsible for events carried out in the hospital, not for the long infectious history of the child. Those are some powerful words. There's some really powerful stuff in here that makes you go like, how did these wrongfully convicted cases happen so badly? Like they get screwed up so bad. So based on this, Dr. Laposata opined that the presence of hemorrhages in the brain and behind the eyes and bruises are all commonly observed in patients with DIC. All of the findings in Nikki's case associated with bleeding are clearly reflective of the presence of DIC. To the extent that there were other minor injuries, Nikki's minor bruises on her face captured in the hospital photos and scalp are entirely consistent with Robertson's effort to wake her, the life-saving efforts to resuscitate her upon her revival at the ER, and then subsequent treatment by her medical providers during the course of her hospitalization. So all the treatments and all of the resuscitation efforts can cause bruising on the body. Just him trying to wake her up that morning could have caused bruising if um, she had already developed this, as this doctor said, months prior to this. Applicant's behavior after Nikki's death is attributable to his undiagnosed autism. This is a finding by the higher court. They're saying, wait a minute now. We find that the applicant does have autism. At the time, it was undiagnosed, so we find that that is also attributed to um, that, to what we thought was his guilt. For example, Detective Brian Wharton, the lead detective in Nikki's death, signed an affidavit early on stating the lack of emotion he displayed and the seeming lack of understanding about what was happening to him did not seem right. His demeanor did not seem normal, and that something seemed wrong with him is something that was discussed. Witnesses we interviewed at the hospital also mentioned how Mr. Robertson seemed odd. He was not behaving as expected, either for a distraught parent or a suspect. How about for someone with autism, though? I learned only years later that he had since been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And this is another statement from the second screenshot is also from Brian Wharton. He says, I had doubts then, but today I am certain that nothing here supports a continued effort by the state to execute Mr. Robertson. So he is fully advocating for Robertson's release and thinks that he is innocent. Continuing on with the Texas Criminal Court of Appeals ruling, they say applicant was accused by 3 witnesses at trial of having disciplined or shaken Nikki in the past and of having no reaction or a delayed reaction when transporting Nikki to the hospital and speaking with doctors. It is unclear why the court now finds such evidence persuasive against Robertson, especially when we now know that these reactions were a result of his undiagnosed autism. The higher courts are saying, hey, you lower courts, I don't know why you're holding this against him anymore because we've already decided or determined he's got autism and his behavior, his affect, and the things that people thought were off or odd were because of his autism. So this court is saying, lower court, get yourself in check. The underlying principle between Rourke and this case is the same. When the science relied upon by the state is obtaining a conviction in containing in let me start that over again. The underlying principle between Rourke and this case is the same. When the science relied upon by the state in obtaining a conviction is called into question by the medical community. So the medical community is like, hey, wait a minute, shaken baby syndrome doesn't exist. It's not a thing. Such that the applicant would not be convicted during or using the relevant evidence today, that applicant is entitled to habeas relief. So this is the higher court saying we're giving you habeas. Applicants' contravening evidence establishes that Nikki died from a combination of undiagnosed chronic interstitial viral pneumonia, prescription medications that suppressed her breathing, and her infection that developed into sepsis, which caused DIC, a severe and often fatal bleeding disorder. This higher court is finding that that is the cause of Nikki's death. A jury today would not have heard the same conclusions from Dr. Urban as the jury in 2002 did. As we noted in Rourke, Dr. Urban would be confronted. This is wild that this is in here. Dr. Urban, the medical examiner, would be confronted with 20 years of reputable scientific studies and publications that, if graphed, continually point away from their stated positions. if Dr. Urban were to experience the ostrich effect and wish to bury her head in the sand, so she's going to just die on this hill and say, nope, it was shaken baby syndrome, then she would have to bear the brunt of a grueling cross examination. They're like, get your ass on the stand and support your findings if you really think that that's what it was. Instead, a jury would be presented with expert testimony indicating that applicant's story of fall from the bed was consistent with Nikki's injuries. Applicant's 2003 trial, as well as the habeas court, did not have the benefit of our decision in Rourke. I would remand Article 11.073, that's the junk science article, and his actual innocence claims to the habeas. So he on two claims they're remanding it back to the trial court, to the habeas court for an evidentiary hearing in light of Rourke. Applicant has alleged facts that are at least minimally sufficient to bring him within the ambit of a new legal basis for relief that we announced in Rourke. Conclusion: the penalty of death is qualitatively different from any other sentence. This qualitative difference between death and other penalties calls for a greater degree of reliability when the death sentence is imposed. So you need to be certain if you're going to put him on death row and execute this man for something that science says doesn't exist now. Okay. Judge Parker says that applicant has been given numerous bites of the apple already. For approximately 15 years on his journey to seek relief from his conviction, he has in fact had an entire apple pie, according to this other judge. The reality, however, is that this court's repeated dismissals of applicant's claims without considering the merits have barred him a seat at the table upon which the proverbial pie even rests. So he can't even go to the table because he's just been barred because of this junk science. So basically, they're saying they're overturning it because they have to. Because it's the only way. If this science is not accurate anymore, or you were put away for something that experts wouldn't testify to today, you shouldn't be behind bars, obviously. So, obviously, there are some systemic issues going on. This 2021 junk science law now allows experts to um, give science about, or to provide. Hold on, I gotta readjust my seating here. Oh, that's better. My leg was all twisted because my dog was sleeping. Yeah, anyways, I had to untwist my leg. Sorry. It's falling asleep. So the the junk science law that I was talking about, this law came into play in 2021, where you can now bring in experts to refute junk science in your case, but it's not retroactive. So the cases prior to 2021 weren't getting relief. However, Roberson was excluded because he was stuck with his junk science and relying on his appeal, so they allowed it. And the 2024, I knew I had a date there, 2024 ex parte Rourke ruling set the precedent so that the law can apply if new evidence is strong enough to prove evidence. That's basically what they said in this ex parte Rourke, is that even if you're an older case and you don't fit with this junk science law, you're not it's not applicable to you because it's not retroactive. We still can say, hey, we can review this evidence because it might prove it's enough to prove innocence. So with all of that bearing in mind, they granted him relief, his habeas relief, and remanded it. So, also, systemic issues is that the death penalty risks executing innocent people, which has happened time and time again, I am sure. So, Robertson wouldn't be the first, and he's not going to be the last because our system is very messed up. And of course, the autism biases undermine fair trials. So, and especially when they didn't even know that he had autism, and people are just saying, well, he was weird, or he was odd, or he didn't act right. Well, how would you act? Put yourself in a situation and you don't know what you're going to do. No one knows. Anyways, moving on. So the widespread support for Robertson, there is lots of it. There are over 34 scientists and doctors, medical professionals that back Robertson's innocence. 86 bipartisan Texas legislators urge his clemency. They've been, advocating for him. 8 autism groups have also been out there highlighting the misjudgment issues that are going on in cases like his. And the famous author John Grisham got introduced to this case, and he's also been advocating for Robertson, as well as faith leaders and others alike. So, some key voices of support that Robertson has: Detective Brian Wharton, the one who originally thought he was guilty, says, I was wrong. He's innocent. And that's actually him visiting Robert in prison. Dr. Phil has heard of this case and says this is 100% a miscarriage of justice. There's also a group of Texas bishops that have been urging clemency, and this Gretchen Sween, who is the lead appellate attorney for Robert Robertson, says that an objective review of the evidence will prove that there was no crime. Robertson did not do anything wrong, and she's so confident in the evidence that if a review happens, other people would find that too. Public legislation, action, lawmakers, testimony. So the lawmakers, those bipartisan, we're going to go back to that. So when he was first on death row and they stayed his execution 90 minutes beforehand, they were all playing games with him. So there were these lawmakers that wanted his testimony in an attempt to save him, right? So they wanted it helped free him, at least freed up some time for him. But that attempt was blocked by the AG. Why is the AG fighting it so bad? They, the AG did not want him to testify for some reason. And then he turned around and tried to set another execution date, even though there was an appeal pending. As for wrongfully convicted cases, specifically on shaken baby syndrome, there's been over 1 million signatures for similar innocence cases like this. So people are, I mean, this is a topic that we need to evaluate. 2002, 2003 is not that long ago. At least it doesn't feel like to me. And yet here we are, and we know we're so much better informed and we know better. And so why are we sticking to the old ways in our legal system and not catching up to the science? I just don't get it. Anyways, a Texas committee, the Texas committee, there was a Texas committee that came together to, I'm trying to remember this bullet. There's so much in this case. I don't know. Texas committee says junk science law unfulfilled. So the courts aren't, oops, I have a misspelling there. The courts aren't applying the law consistently. So that's okay. So there was a committee that was reviewing this case, and they're saying that the junk science law, that 2021 law, is uh, not being applied retroactively. It's not being applied consistently. Some people get it, some people don't. So there's a big flaw. There's a big issue in the justice system where um, that might need to be looked at. And the public is urged to share Roberson's case and other cases like his on social media. Autism and justice. So there's the Autism Society, who says demeanor can be misread as guilt. Obviously, I mean, We need to start understanding people more and not judging to like rushing to conclusions and judging people so instantaneously. Instead, ask questions, learn from them, learn who they are, learn their mannerisms and their affect. If his affect is like that all the time, I mean, the investigators should have maybe even asked about his affect, asked other people in their investigation, but it seems like they rushed to judgment. And Brian Wharton says, he's innocent now. The fact that autism can sometimes be diagnosed much later in life, as in Roberson's case, is very common in poorer communities. Um, or just sometimes people don't want to deal with their own health stuff, their own issues. So they just learn to cope and they don't go to a doctor and get a diagnosis. They just deal. So that's another thing that people don't necessarily get a diagnosis of autism early on. We need autism training for police and courts alike, for the police, judges, prosecutors, anyone who is trying to put people away because they don't act right. They need training. They need serious training on how people with autism can react and what their affect is like in stressful situations because it is not like you and I necessarily. We might freak out. We might do something, who knows? You never know unless you're in a situation. But I'm more like emotional. I'll say that. I'm more of an emotional person and I get emotional in situations. So, but he doesn't. And that's okay. That's okay that he's like that. But the courts just and the police say no, that's not okay. Medical staff too says no, it's not okay to be autistic and to not have feelings when your daughter is going through something medically. You need to be locked up for that, apparently. And neurodiversity misjudgments cause wrongful convictions all the time. So just think about this. Roberson is just one case. How many more shaken baby syndrome cases are there that are not real? How many more people have been put away because they're autistic and they just didn't act right in the situation? I'm thinking probably many, too many that we'll never know the answer to that. So, call to action at this point, what you can do, first, US. Oh, that's right. I totally forgot about that point. This is the first execution of someone for, or the first scheduled execution for someone who supposedly committed shaken baby syndrome. Okay, so why are we doing this? Isn't There's no precedent for executing people for this, so why are we executing Roberson? That's another reason that this is important. Why we should act on this, on trying to spread awareness on his case. It also exposes disability bias in the justice system, his case. So anyone who thinks someone with autism just doesn't act right, there's a bias there. There's a bias. You think someone should act a certain way, but that's not always the case. Everybody's different. The death penalty also risks irreversible errors. So once it's done, it's final. You can't be like, oh, well, we executed him, but now you can have your appeal. It doesn't work that way. You have to have your rulings first instead of how the AG did it this past time around and just scheduled him for execution, even though he had an appeal pending. And public action can influence outcomes. He has been getting people to stand up and show up for him. You can help by learning more at innocenceproject.org. You can share his story on social media. You can go to innocenceproject.org and share uh, articles about Roberson, you can share this video. You can also contact Governor Abbott in Texas for clemency. Ask him to allow him to be free. Tell him you believe Roberson is innocent. And you can also advocate for retroactive laws and autism awareness. That is something that gets overlooked, especially retroactively. So it's great that they're doing all this stuff, 2021 and beyond, 2024 and beyond, but we have to go back and now start retroactively fixing or rectifying things from past cases like Roberson's. So hopefully you guys got a little bit of an education on shaken baby syndrome and how someone can easily be, well, nearly executed, but convicted and on death row for over 20 years on something that was completely made up. Shaken baby syndrome is a complete garbage diagnosis. And we know that now. And anyone that's been convicted for shaken baby syndrome should be reevaluated and looked at. And hopefully this case, and explaining this case helps you see that. So thank you guys so much for watching. Please let me know in the comments below what you think about this particular case, what you think about um, wrongful convictions as a whole. Um, I just think it's a travesty that it can happen like that. And it's kudos to Detective Wharton for admitting I was wrong and this guy's innocent, and now he's advocating for his release, which not a lot of detectives do that. So in this case, that is unique in that he actually has someone who wanted to put him away for this evidence, now is saying this evidence is garbage. So I don't know. Hopefully you got a little bit out of that, and I will see you guys next Thursday for we will start the corruption files, which I'm just going to do deep dives on all sorts of different things and go from there. So let me know in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye now. That's it for Innocence Lost. Thanks for reflecting on these injustices with me. Like, subscribe for more wrongfully convicted cases, and let me know your thoughts below.